Reverb is one of those things in music production that everyone uses, but no one really understands. So let me ask you this, do you know the real difference between convolution reverb, algorithmic reverb, plates, chambers, springs, halls, and all the other programs that are available? And let's get one level deeper. What about all the parameters inside of your reverb? From pre-delay to early reflections, diffusion, density, and all the other things that you can dial in to make your reverbs blend in the mix nicely and do just the thing that you want to do. It gets pretty overwhelming, and where there is overwhelm, there is opportunity, a wise mentor of mine once said. And so in this tutorial, I'm going to walk you through all the reverb things you need to know and how to use them in your mixes effectively. So make sure to stick around till the end of this video, because you're going to walk away with the knowledge and skills to dial in the perfect reverb settings every single time, and you will know why you chose these settings instead of relying on presets. If you are new to this channel, I have a free gift for you. It's called the Finisher Framework, my 3 simple steps that you can use to finish at least one great sounding song per month. You can get it at pickyourself.com/framework. The link is also in the description. First of all, let's answer the question what reverb you want to use for what purpose and why. Now, there are different types of reverbs, and I'm going to explain exactly what these reverb types are and why you want to choose one over the other. The first thing you need to understand is the fundamental difference between convolution reverb and algorithmic reverb. Those are simply the two fundamental principles of modeling room sound. So here on the screen you can see a algorithmic reverb. This is the TSAR by Softube and the Convolution Reverb Pro by Ableton. Let's start with the algorithmic reverb. So as the name implies, an algorithmic reverb relies on an algorithm. So the reverb is completely programmed. The room is an artificial one that's just created by whatever parameters you decide that it has. And it just calculates the type of reflections that come back from this. And depending on what exact algorithmic reverb you are using, you have more or less parameters, and you can dial it in certain ways to create the type of room sound that you want. But it's not coming from a real room. It just emulates the feeling of space. Now, in contrast to that, a convolution reverb relies on a so-called impulse response of a real room that was captured. So they put a measurement microphone in, let's say, a studio or a large cathedral or whatever you want to capture. And then they either pop a balloon, that's kind of the quick and dirty way of capturing an impulse response, or they do a sine sweep, so a large sine wave going from really deep frequencies until the very highest ones. And this creates the possibility for you to later on run your material through that room by using that impulse response. Now, here is a trick question for you. Isn't a convolution reverb always better then because it relies on a real room? Well, yes and no, because if you want to create, let's say, a realistic sounding environment, then yes, in most cases, the convolution reverb will do a better job. But then in a real mixing scenario, especially in electronic music, I personally think that sometimes a convolution reverb is the right choice, sometimes an algorithmic reverb is the right choice. And the benefits of an algorithmic reverb very often is the complexity that you can achieve. So you can dial in a lot of different parameters and design exactly the type of space that you want. And even if it sounds more artificial than the convolution reverb, very often it creates exactly the sense of space, the sense of depth that you want to achieve much better, which is quite interesting. And then finally, there's also a third category, which is a mixture of algorithmic and convolution reverb. So for example, the Ableton Hybrid Reverb is a true hybrid of the two approaches. So as you can see in the Ableton Hybrid Reverb, you have convolution impulse response and you have a reverb algorithm that you can select, and then you can blend the two to taste, which is fantastic, and very often you get great results also by combining the two approaches. Let's now take a listen to some of these reverbs and see what we can do with them. So this session here is sounding completely dry like this. And we're going to use reverbs to kind of create some plasticity in the sounds, create a sense of depth without swamping everything. So you probably know that panning means left to right stereo panorama, but I think about reverb in terms of front to back panning, which is also a cool way to conceptualize the whole thing. And I typically give most elements in my mix a really tight and close reverb and only one or two elements, this like lush and large reverb, because if you do it in a different way and give large rooms to everything, well, it creates a muddy mix and nothing is defined. You get no transient information, nothing pops out. And so I really like this contrast. So here we, for example, have our shakers and our hi-hats, and we have a send channel where I have these different reverbs on. And we have the Convolution Reverb Pro as the first thing. The other two are deactivated. I'm just going to show you what this sounds like now. With a shaker. And then let's listen to a couple of those spaces here. And already you can tell the difference in those rooms. So this is a room with a very long reverb tail. It seems to be some kind of chapel. The one before was a small club. And the one before that was Club Med, which maybe means medium, I don't know. But this is like a really tight and small space. So for percussions, this tends to be a really good choice. Because it still lets the transients come through. Now I'm over-exaggerating the reverb amount, so typically I would use a little bit less, but just for you to kind of hear it properly. Now let's contrast that with the algorithmic reverb. I'm going to dial in a similar setting here. So we're going to use a small room or medium room, if the other one was also medium. On the time, which is kind of the room size, how long it rings out, we're just going to use something really close. And then this is like a really important parameter, the early reflections. Early reflections just mean how much of this first portion here do you have in your reverb and how much of the tail is in there. So if I go here to reverb, which means just a reverb tail, it means that we have something like this large chapel from before. So this would be a long tail, not so many early reflections. But if I go to early reflections, it's something that sounds like really close. And early reflections are just the first reflections from the sound source to the nearest boundary. Yeah, and it comes back. Maybe one or two other reflections back as well. But this is kind of the thing that early reflection defines. And so let's listen to that now. Now the convolution reverb. And now you can decide, okay, what is the kind of character that I want? Because I maybe want the small room from the TSAR because it just sounds better. The other one, the Convolution Reverb Pro, in this specific example, created a couple of low-mid bumps that I personally don't really vibe with. I think this one sounds better here in this occasion. But then you could also try out the hybrid reverb and see what that does. We'll use convolution reverb with a lot of early reflections. So Ableton Studio, yeah, that's fine. Serial just means the one reverb is feeding into the other one. And here we also use, let's use Dark Hall and damp it a little bit. Bring the size of the room down and make it closer. And then obviously 100% wet because we're using a send channel. Yeah, very interesting. So the hybrid reverb now sounds a bit closer to the TSAR and not so much like the convolution reverb. You understand, like there is no one thing is better than the other. It's more like a preference thing. You can choose what type of algorithm or convolution reverb sounds better in this specific use case. And once you dial in a lot of different reverbs, you get to know your own favorite settings for specific instruments. If you got something out of this video so far, then like it and make sure to subscribe to the channel because I'm going to put out a lot of videos like this one in the near future and you don't want to miss it. Let's now go to the exact opposite of the spectrum and we create something that sounds huge. Let's now dial in a plate reverb for our lead sounds. So the lead sounds in solo sound like this. And there's a little delay on one of them, but no reverb at all. And we want to make the sound huge. So this is really the one element that I want to prioritize mix-wise here. And I want to embed that in a nice lush reverb. So first of all, what even is a plate reverb? Let me show you on the Soundtoys website. So this is the EMT-140, one of the most famous plate reverbs, looks like this. And you have a vibrating metal plate here and different contact microphones that capture the sound. And obviously a preamp to amplify the signal. And depending on how all of that circuitry is designed, it sounds different. And also what type of plate you use, it sounds different. And obviously you don't want that huge thing in your living room or in your bedroom studio. Or maybe you want, but I don't have space for that. It's a different concept here as well. So you can see it's always the same concept. You have a vibrating plate and then some contact microphones attached to that capture the sound. Now, In a DAW, this looks a little bit more clean, like this here. This is the Super Plate plugin. And you can switch between the different plate models here and dial in how long everything rings out. Decide what pre-delay you want. And this is a parameter that we haven't talked about yet. So pre-delay is the time difference between the original signal and when the reverb starts. So you can use this to keep the original signal cleaner. Yeah, so let's say you want a super lush reverb on something, but you still want to hear a lot of the original signal. You can use some pre-delay to space those two elements apart, the original sound source and the reverb. Yeah, let's try this out. So this is pre-delay at 0. Now let's ramp this up. And you will hear, when I press play, you will hear a noticeable difference between the original signal and when the reverb starts. Could you hear it? Like the reverb swells in a little bit later. I'm going to make it more extreme. But obviously it also rings out a little bit longer in the end. You can then dial this in by, for example, make it really short. Or you go super extreme, so here it starts to kind of feedback a little bit on its own. Now modulation, this is basically some kind of a chorus setting depending on how everything is dialed in. You can use this to further separate the original sound source from the reverb. So you create a reverb that doesn't even want to sound realistic. This is what plates are designed for. Plates are not designed for sounding realistic, like a real room. They are there for character. Same holds true for what type of preamp settings you use and how much you drive the input. All of these nice things you can do here. All of these are just sound design choices. You can even load up this tweak panel here and, for example, dial in how fast the modulation rate is. You can dial in something that's called auto decay, which is a ducking function of the reverb. It's like the easiest way to describe it. And you can dial in something like the stereo width. Why do we have an EQ on a reverb? Bell shape EQ and then the filters top and bottom. Now, this is just one more way of deciding where you want to pan elements in a front to back panning scenario. So imagine this, I'm standing right in front of you and I'm speaking to you in the same room. Of course, you get a lot of the high end because high end information has low energy, overall low acoustic energy. So you get a lot of it when I'm close to you. If I stand, 100 meters away from you in a large cathedral, you probably only get bass information from me because the high end didn't make it to you. And you can use this psychoacoustic concept of how we then perceive depth and space. You can use this to your advantage and design a reverb that sounds like it's super far away, just by, for example, reducing the top end. Or do the opposite. We can also use it to separate even further the original source from the reverb. So if I want maximum separation here, what I would do is I would dial in a super lush reverb. I would use a little bit of modulation, a little bit of pre-delay. I would probably filter out the super low end here just because it will pile up quite a bit in the bass and I don't want that. And I would also dampen the top end a little bit because I want my lead sounds to cut through but still have a little bit of this lush reverb behind it. And then it's just a mixture of how much do we want to send to this. Very interesting. So this is the tube sound, I think. Gives us a different character. I really like it. Now, can you achieve the same type of sound with a purely algorithmic reverb? Absolutely. Let me show you. So here's our good friend, the TSAR, and it's one of my favorite algorithmic reverbs. It stands the test of time, it sounds fantastic, and I can use it for pretty much everything. So here we will send a portion of the same sound sources that we just had to this. And now you can think through this with me. How would you dial in the same sound here? Do we have a lot of early reflections in a plate reverb? No, not at all. We have a ton of reverb tail, so this is why we have this like lush sound. We can dial in a pre-delay, so the separation between the original signal and the reverb tail. So let's dial this in at 100 milliseconds, around that. We make it pretty long here. The density setting is also quite an interesting parameter. So density is kind of the richness, the complexity of the reverb. Set this to high. And then tone and high cut is kind of the EQ curves that we can use. Tone is almost like a tilt filter, so you can dial in a more brighter tone or a darker tone. So here we will go for a little bit more dark. And high cut, you can then cut out even more of the highs. If you use this as a send effect, you can also just place a EQ right behind this on the chain and then do whatever you want to this. But I'm most of the time pretty happy here. And here modulation, I like this random setting quite a lot. And diffusion is also just a different shape of the room, like how diffuse the surface of these room areas are. Now let's see how that sounds. I would say that's damn close to the plate that we just had. And so this is what tells you, like, okay, I can completely transform a room in whatever I want it to be with a algorithmic reverb. I can now dial this back in and create a super close early reflection room. Yeah, let's do the exact opposite here. Now this type of room just gives us the sense of space without flooding everything with reverb. And this brings me to another concept. You can also combine reverbs. There's nothing wrong with sending some portion of the signal to this reverb, which is send B, and then another portion of it to reverb C, which is our plate reverb. So just because this doesn't exist in real life, you don't stand in two rooms at the same time, this doesn't mean that it's not possible to do in the DAW, and it might sound fantastic. So let's check this out here. And I especially like this technique with vocals. It's really nice to give vocals, first of all, a sense of space that you don't really perceive, and then have a tail that follows with a plate reverb, for example. And you can even make it more complex and put a delay before the plate reverb. So let me show you what that does. It starts to become more rhythmical again. And this might or might not be the right choice for you, but you now get the idea. You can combine everything. Sometimes you just dial in a preset and it sounds fantastic, but I think it's really valuable to know the concepts behind this. That is it. Thanks for watching. And before you leave, make sure to leave a comment below. I'm really active in the comments. I answer all your questions, and I would just like to hear your feedback on this and also suggestions for new videos. I'm really active in there. I listen to the people who are watching this, and I would love to see you in another video soon.